Hi guys, I got a quick instancing tutorial for you today. It's inspired by this one I saw a few weeks ago by Cosmic Ninja. He did this like wire type grow effect. And I wanted to do something similar, but I wanted to have mine be able to follow a spline. And I also wanted it to be all the animation to be relative to that spline. So you'll see what I'm getting at when I do it. But this is what it was inspired by. I also am going to use instances for mine. Um, but another way that you could do the effect that I'm about to do is with hard link and parts and part move. You could do a similar effect to you could probably recreate it exactly, but I'm going to do this with instances because I think it just shows a lot that you can do with nodes and instances. It's much more flexible this way. But it's a pretty cool effect, so let's get started. Okay, I sped the modeling up 2 times, so I'll try and just narrate it as I go. So I'm just creating a disk with 24 segments, and I want each one of them segments to be about a half a meter. And I'm just going to bevel that, and then I'm just going to cut the center one out, and put that on a new layer. And then for the other layer with the outside, I'm just going to rotate that 7.5 degrees so it's straight up and down on the axis. And I'm just going to isolate one single segment. I'm going to extrude that. I'm going to F2 it. So now I'm centered. Now over top of that, I'm just using that as a guide. I'm going to drag out another disc, make it 6 sides for a hexagon. Scale it to the size I need. Size doesn't have to be exact because we can adjust it the grid size in layout, but I'm just using that background piece as just as a guide to go off of. So I'm just going to slice that down the middle because it'll make using rounder easier. So I'm just going to select the top and bottom edges, and I'm going to rounder that with 80 millimeters. Project inset, yes, and I'm going to use OpenGL polys, and I'm just going to set that so that the segments are about equal. And I'm going to band glue that center section there. Now I'm going to cut these. So I'm making these cuts because it'll let me use rounder without having them all in one go. It's a little more work, but there's other ways to go about it. This is just how I did it. So now I'll select those edges that I want to use rounder on. And then I'll rounder those edges 30 millimeters. So it's just kind of giving me this soft looking hexagon. And I want the project inset to be no, and I want to fix the OGL poly so that they're about even with the rest of the geometry. So now I just delete that top and the bottom. And there was 2 1-point polys there that I deleted. So now I'm just going to band glue all these. There were those cuts that I made that I really didn't need. They were just there, temporary. Just trying to keep the geometry as low as possible. And then I'll cap off both sides. So that'll be our little segment. I'm just going to name it surface segment. Put smoothing on. I'm going to cut the first layer and then paste that other one in there. So now we just have the segment and then the disc that I'm extruding right now at 50 meters with 100 segments. I'm going to call that inner surface. Now I'm just going to name the layers segment and inner. I'm going to save the object as segment. So I just have those 2 layers. So now what we're going to do, we're just going to load that layer in the layout. So I'm going to load layer 1 segment. I'm just going to turn it off so it doesn't render. And I'm going to fix my grid size. And I'm going to add instances to that, DP instancer. And I'm going to turn the motion blur, I'm going to add that object to the instancer, turn motion blur steps to 1, turn it on grouped and pivot. And then for the amount, I'm going to do 24 times 200. So that gives me 4,800. And that should be it. So now we can go into the nodes and start setting this up. This is where 90% of this setup is in this node editor. So the first thing we need is we need to get the index of the instance. So I'll get dpkit instance info, and I'll get an add. I'm going to add -1 because the instance index starts at 1 and I want it to start at 0. Then I'm going to get a mod, and I'm going to get a constant integer, and I'm going to use 24 because that's how many segments we have. So I'm just going to mod the index by 24. Now what I'm going to get is ASTools pi. Just gives me, it's a constant for pi. Gives you a couple different outputs. So I want to get the step angle that we need for each, in between each one of these. So I'm just going to get a divide. And what I can do is I can divide 2 pi, which is 360 degrees, divided by our 24. So that'll give me the step angle. So now I'm just going to make a vector here. And we'll get math trigonometry cosine, math trigonometry sine. And what we can do is we can use these to put these in the circle. So what's happened here is we're just counting the 24 over and over and over again with the mod. And then we're getting a step angle from that, which is 7.5 degrees, but we used it here, 2 pi divided by our so we just go in, then we multiply them together, and we go into the cosine and sine, and then we use that to drive the x and the y for our position. So now we got to deal with the actual rotation, because that only positioned them where we want them in a circle. We still need to deal with the rotation. So we have that. It's the same rotation as that we use to move it. But we also have to, it's off by 90 degrees. So if I get negative 90 degrees, so if I get pi divided by 2 and then multiply that by -1 and then add that to this, that'll adjust for that. So now you'll see that they're all facing the direction that we need them facing. So we just added or subtracted 90 degrees from it, from all of them. So now the next thing we got to do is we got to deal with the radius. So if we get a constant scalar, and I'm going to get 2 multiply nodes here. So if we multiply cosine and sine by our radius here, then we can tell how big do we want this to be. So I just eyeball it here because it's just the easiest way to do it, because I wasn't super precise with when I made it in Modeler, but this works just as well. So I just eyeball it for now, and then later on I'll make it better. So I'm going to use 3 for the radius for now, but that'll get changed. Okay, so now what we need to do now is, now that we have them all going around in a circle, we need to get groups of 24 and deal with the z-axis, where they are along the z. So I'm just going to get the same. I'm going to get the index -1, and I'm going to divide that by 24, and then I'm going to floor that. So that'll basically just give me groups of 24. And then what I can do here is I can use that to push them down on the z. So, well, first, I'll get to that mod in a second, but the first thing I need to do is get a multiply here. And then if we multiply that floored amount by any number, we can adjust where these are on the Z. So you can, like I said, I'm just guesstimating for this now. So now what we need to do is that every other row, we need to rotate it by a half of 7.5 degrees. So that's what that mod does. I'm going to mod by 2. So that'll give me every other row. And then I can say it'll just count to 0 and 1 over and over and over again. So I can say if it equals 1, then make the true that same angle divided by 2. So it'd be divided by 7.5 comes out of there, and then we're dividing that by 2. And then that's how much we want to rotate every other row. Extra. So I'll add that in. You'll see I'll add that amount in. It gets a little, this isn't complex if you work along and do it, but a lot of the nodes look the same, so it kind of gets confusing. I noticed that. So now I'll just add that amount in there. And you'll see it'll rotate every other row. That'll give me a hex grid. So you can see my guesstimation was pretty good, but I want them to have more space than that. So I'm just going to save the scene as Nodal inst 001. Okay. So now, like I said, I want there to be more space than that, because if I bend this, I don't want there to be any intersection. So if they're right up on each other, when I bend it, there's going to be intersection, and I don't want that. So that's why I'm making them a little further apart. And that's just with that radius amount that I had done, that one scalar, and then that multiply that comes out of that floored amount there. That'll adjust just the grid in both directions, those two amounts. Okay, so now the next thing I want to do is put this on a spline. So I'm going to get DP kit displacement spline deformer. I'm going to create 7 knots at 10 meters apart. I'm going to create the items. And then I'm just going to turn the samples up, make it smooth, fixed length. And then I'm just going to turn off those instances so I can isolate just the spline, and then I'll deal with making this the shape that I want it. I sped this up a good bit. It's just me placing these knots where I want them for the spline, just to get some sort of an interesting shape. But you can see what I'm doing. It's not really anything crazy. I just was trying to give it somewhat of an interesting shape. Yeah, the better way to do this would be to make the spline in modeler of the shape you wanted to use, or at least the starting shape that you want to use. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that shape. Now we can just finish putting those instances back on the spline here. Make them go along the spline. So I'm going to turn them instances back on. So now what we want to do is we want to take what was driving our Z here, and we just want to put that into the covered distance of our spline deformer. And now what we got to do is we got to do a little bit of matrix math here. So I'm going to get a math vector add, and I'm going to get a math vector matrix HBB to matrix, and I'm going to get a math vector transform 2. And I want that to be inverse transform. And I'm going to get a math vector HPB add. So the first thing we want to do is we want to turn that rotation into a matrix. We go into the transform with that. And we want to transform our position that we had coming out before. And what we want to do is Now I messed up there. I actually want to add that position to the position of the spline, like that. So that'll give me the correct position along the spline. Now we still have to deal with the rotation because right now we're only dealing with the one rotation that we created. But we also got to take into account the rotation from the spline. So if you get the rotation from the spline, and if you add that to the other rotation, and we go into the rotate, you'll see that it'll give us the correct rotation that we need for our instances. So that's pretty much all there is to getting it to go on the spline. I think I tidied these up a bit here, just so it's easier to understand. It does get a little bit, it's actually not that bad if you work along with it, but just they all start to look the same if you just look at it. Because I have the, when I recorded this, I had the a screenshot of the actual node network on my other monitor, and I was working off of that, and it was just easier not to even look at it, to be honest. I just worked through it. I didn't even look at the screen because it just makes it even more confusing. It's definitely better to just work through it. So I just put everything in order. I didn't change anything there. I just made it so it was kind of easier for me to see what was going on. Okay, so now the next thing we want to deal with is the animation. So I'm going to grab a null. I'm just going to call it seg control. And I'll make a grid, 10 meters on the Z. So we're just going to use this to control the animation, the timing of the animation. So I'll just put a quick animation on this null. Just rough for now, just about what it's going to need to be. And I'm making my animation 120 frames, so it'll be 4 seconds. So now I'm going to get that null in here. I'm going to get dpkit item info, select the seg control, get a vector scaler, filter out the Z. So now what we want to do is we just want to get the difference between, now that's our distance along our spline. So we can use that same distance there to get the length of our, it's basically the length of our tube. So now I'm just going to get the difference between them and plug them into a gradient. I'm going to make it from 0 to 15. Show output for both. So now we're going to adjust that radius. So I'm just going to use that same amount for the final size, and then I'm just going to multiply it by 2.5 to get the size before I want to animate it. Then I'm just going to replace that with what I had as the, you'll see what it does here. So that's just replacing that constant radius with the animation radius, and that gives us that. So I also want to deal with the scale on that as well, so that you can't see them in the beginning. I eventually will switch these over to a curve node, but just to set it up, it's easier to use gradients. So I've just used the same input. It's the distance between the Z distance between the null and our pieces. And you can see I just need to flip it. Now, I wanted to make this a little more interesting because, I mean, it's kind of uniform. I didn't really like the way that was looking. So what I end up doing here is I'm just going to get a make vector. Or, I think, yeah, vector. And what I want to do is I want to get the for the x and the y, I'm going to use the sine and the cosine, and I'm going to use our distance along the z. So that's just giving me a cylinder before a cylinder. And because you got to remember, all of our instances are right at the origin. So if I try and use a procedural texture to do any sort of offset, it's going to think that all my instances are at the origin. So I have to give it like a straight tube of where my instances are. So now you'll see if I go into the time with my alpha there, it looks exactly the same, or it did offset it a little bit. But if I go into the position, now you can see that that procedural is based on those instances as if they were in a straight tube along the z-axis. So now I'm just adjusting the frequencies and the size of that procedural. I made it 500 millimeters with, and I'm turning the opacity down to 50. And you can see the effect it's having. So now, next thing I do, I can't remember, what do I do next? Let's see. Oh, I probably set up the curve node, and so I switch out those gradients. I may do a quick preview. I don't remember. Let's see. Oh, I know what I do. I don't want that, I want to move that gradient a bit. So I'm just going to add some to that position. Just going to animate it slightly. And that makes it not so uniform. It makes them change speeds, actually. It makes them slow down and speed up, but not very drastically. But it does, it looks more pleasing when you do it this way. So that it's not one uniform speed. Some of them will speed up and some of them will slow down. So that's why I like doing it this way. And you can see, as I'm moving it, you can see it's affecting it in the back. So that's pretty much all I do. I probably do with the curves now, because it looks way better when you do it with the curve node and use a. Now I could do it with. I could also use the wrap node to do this as well out of the gradient, but I just use the curve node here. I do a quick preview first just to see what it's looking like. Like I said, I do the curve node because I wasn't pleased with the way that looked. So, I'm just moving that stuff out of the way. That's what deals with the animation, that bottom section. So I'm just getting a curve. I'm going to use the same input. And I'm going to use the same amounts as well. So the keys will be exactly the same as they were in a gradient. But the only thing that's, I changed the fall off, and it makes the animation way better. So now, the keys are basically, it's the same keys as that were in the gradient. So the only difference is that I can adjust the fall off here to get what I want. And you can see, you'll see as when I show you That's actually the opposite of what I wanted. I want it going the other way. That's what I wanted, like that. So now I also deal with the scale too, because I actually want the scale to be the opposite of that. I want them to get big fast. So I just use that same one, and I just switch the keys around. So the scale goes from 0 to 1 during the same amount of time. It's just the same. The only thing is the values change from 0 to 1. So plug that in. And that's actually reversed as well. I want it to go the other way. Like that. Yeah. So that's pretty much the end effect. I do deal with, there's a little more I want to do with the rotation. I want them to twist around the spline. Like, I don't want it to be a straight hexagon grid. I want it to actually be a twisted hexagon grid. So that's the next thing I deal with here. So that was just switching out those gradients for those two curve nodes, just so I could have better control over the fall off. So now what we want to do is I want to twist these along the spline. So the way I can do that is just use that same fluid index there, and I could just multiply by that and add that into our rotation. So you'll see if I just grab that fluid index there, and now if I multiply that by any number, it'll start to rotate it along the spline. You'll see in a second. So I'll just add that to the rotation. Now you'll see after I turn Studio Live on, you'll be able to see what's happening easier. It's just twisting them along the, you'll see now. So what's actually happening is the front isn't spinning at all, and the end is spinning, and it's just all the ones in the middle are getting interpolated. So it just makes it so it's not a straight hexagon grid, it's like a twisted hexagon grid. I like that look better. I think it looks better. And now what else I want to do here too is I want to also twist the whole thing. I want the whole thing to be animating on top of this. So right now I'm still just adjusting in the twist to get what I want. But then the next thing I do here is I add another add node. And then what I do with that one is I just give a steady animation that continually twists. And these all get added together because all of these are all for that one rotation amount. So like I said, I'm just putting a little animation on it so that it continually animates as well. So I think I do a quick preview here. So you can see now the whole thing rotates around the spline. Keep in mind this is sped up. This isn't playing back in real time. It's actually playing at 1.25. But that's the animation. So now I'm just going to go back into that instancer. There's a few more things I wanted to do. I wanted to speed that up a little bit so it's spinning faster, just so it's more noticeable. Now you can clearly see how it's twisting around the spline. So that's pretty much all I wanted to do with the animation. So I do set up the surfacing, and I do a bit of post-processing. So I'm just setting up the camera now right where I want it. So I'm putting the perspective view, and then I'm just matching the camera to the perspective view. Now for the AA, I'm going to put it on box reconstruction, fixed, adaptive sampling, 0.005 threshold, and I'm going to put it at 2 samples max, and I'm going to use photo roll motion blur, and for motion blur passes I'm going to use 4. Now for final render I'd probably use 8, but for previewing 4 works fine. There's really no noticeable difference. Now for the depth of field, because I want that stuff that's close to us, I wanted that to blur out a little bit, because I want to focus out further toward the end. So I'm just setting up the focal length here for our depth of field. So I just want to place it out a bit. I think I preview it, yeah. Yep. I just wanted that stuff that was close to us to be a little bit blurred. So I'm good. I just fixed the settings, 5 sides, 45 rotation. That's not really important. So that's the render settings. Like I said, I would put the motion blur passes at 8 if I was doing like for the animation, that's what I rendered it at, that I post. So I just put it on. I'm going to put the light that I had on a DP dome, and I'll put it on spherical. I'm going to use his sampling at 8 samples. I'm going to use an image. I'm going to load an image. It's just a HDR image. It's like a studio lighting image. Turn the brightness to 30. And I'm also going to put important sampling on for that light as well when I realize it. So that's pretty much all I use for lighting. It's just an HDR with important sampling. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting up open image denoiser. So I'm just going to add a pixel filter, node pixel filter, and I'm going to turn on multi-threaded AA and turn on the normal buffer, because we don't get an anti-alias normal buffer, but you can create one by just getting the render buffer here, plugging it into the global buffer, and then you could use that and it'll be anti-aliased. So that's why I'm doing that. Now what I'm doing here is I'm just outputting the RGBA before I do anything to it, so I have both versions, so I could look at, they'll both get outputted to the image viewer. Now I'm adding an image filter, turning on the raw RGB, getting the global buffer, getting the render buffer, getting the open image denoiser, putting it on HDR. So now I'm just taking the color into the color, the raw RGB into the albedo, and then the normal from our global buffer. And I can't say how much I really enjoy that tool. That tool has saved me hours in render time already. It's the best thing that's happened in rendering for a while for me. So that's with the denoiser on. So now what do I do here? I think I deal with the surfacing. So I'd load the other layer. So it's segment layer 2. And what I'm going to do is I just copy that spline deformer and I just put it right into the nodal deformations for that center section, and you see it automatically just put it right along the spline. Just going to turn the smoothing down. I'm going to adjust the scale of this with a DP scale node. So DP kit tools, scale, and this will let me adjust the scale before it goes into the spline deformer, so I can make it fatter and longer to fit what I need it to be. I just wanted to have something in the center of it. I feel like I like it better that way when there's something else growing with it. Then it gives the lighting something to like reflect, and the reflections gives it something to reflect off of. So I'm just adjusting the end length now with that Z. So get a constant scaler. I'm going to go into the offset, so now I can just shift that along the spline. So I can center it exactly where I want it. Making it a little bigger. And I'm just trying to get it centered on there. That's good. So now what we need to do is just make that grow. And we could just do that with the shift extend. So I just cloned that scaler. Now I could have hooked that up to our controller in some way and made it do it, but it was just easier just to keyframe it. There's only one keyframe, so why not? So that's pretty much all I was going for. So that's pretty much it. The rest is pretty much, I got to deal with the surfacing yet. I do some to the surfacing. So for the surfacing for the segments, what I do is I just kind of give them a checkered color. So I just get an instance ID. So I get the instance info, divide, floor, mod. So it's similar to the setup that we did in the other node editor. So I'm just getting the instance index, and I'm going to divide it. I don't have to subtract one because that one actually starts at 0. If you get the instance ID, then it starts at 1. So I'm just dividing it by 24, flooring it, and then modding it by 3. So this is going to give me every 3 rows is going to have, it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2 over and over and over again. Now I'm just going to, so at key 0, key 1, and key 2, I'm going to put these different colors. And I end up changing the colors. The colors aren't really that important because it's just the range that I want them in, because I end up changing the hue. But it's the range that is what matters. So you can see what that gives me. Now, what else I want to do here with the surfacing is I don't want them to be solid. I want to give them like a hollowed out look to them. So what I do here is I just get first I change the colors because I wasn't pleased with that. I wanted more of like a blue yellow. So that's good enough. And what else I want to do is I'm going to use TP Kit shaders and get the edge node. And I'm going to use the edges to make these like hollowed out. So I'm just going to turn the minimum angle on 20 degrees. Going to put it on 0.2. And I'm just going to put the edge into the clip map. And you'll see that'll give us this knocked out look. And I should also turn double siding on before I do a render, but I don't. But I will turn double siding on eventually. So that's all I'm going to do for the surfaces. There's a ton more you could do, but this has already taken a while, so I figured I'd just leave it there. So I'm going to do a test render real quick. So now you'll see I'll turn on double-sided for that surface. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a background sphere. So I'm just going to make a sphere with a radius of 1 kilometer. And I'm just going to offset it on the Y by 1 kilometer. So now I'm going to set up the surface. So I just want the surface to match what my light is. So I'm going to use that same, I'm going to turn the luminosity all the way up, the diffuse down, and spherical. And I'm just going to select that same image that I'm using for my light. So this is basically used for reflections here. I'm going to make it unseen by radiosity, but seen by rays. So I'm going to turn off all the shadows, make it unseen by radiosity, and unseen by camera. So this is what we'll be reflecting in our object in these. Now I'm going to turn GI on, turn off interpolate it, turn off important sampling, turn off everything we don't need in here. So that's pretty good. So now I add some reflections to the segments. I was trying to go for I didn't go too crazy with the surfacing. I was just going for like an anodized metal type of look. So I just turned the color highlights up and put some reflections on. So I get DV&W, math, slick approximation. Put it on 10 and 50. Go into the reflection and the diffuse. Turn up reflection blur to 20. Turn the color highlights to 100. I probably could have went a little less than that, but I wanted that like colored metal look. That's what I was going for. I could have used the material nodes to get it better, but this was good enough for this. So now what I'm doing here is I'm going to add another sphere, and this one's going to be what's seen by the camera. Because for the reflection sphere, I didn't want them blurred. I wanted the actual reflections, the sharp reflections. But for the one that's seen by the camera, I want it to be real blurred. So I'm just going to copy and paste that surface on there. From the other one, I'm going to turn this bitmap strength to 300. And that'll cause the one that gets seen by the camera. So I just go into the render properties for that object, and I do the same thing I did for the other one, except turn off all shadows, and I make it unseen by radiosity, and for this one I make unseen by rays. So this is just going to get seen by the camera. And you'll see now if I do a quick render, you'll see it's real blurred out, which is what I was going for. I just wanted a quick, easy way to kind of like make this look decent. So that's what we got. Now I don't. That's pretty much it. The only other thing else I do is I do a little my normal post-processing stuff that I always do because it adds to it. So you might as well do it. So I just go into the node image filter, and I just add the normal ones that I always do. Fast tone map, vignetting, dispersion, camera response, and bloom. And I just hook them up like I normally do. And for the one that I post on YouTube, I usually do put a little bit of grain in, just because it helps with the compressing. It doesn't band as much, but I didn't do that here. So I put the bloom on 65% at best quality. I put the tone map at Reiner 2 and an exposure or 2. And the camera response, I picked this gold, whatever it was. So, and then it's the same thing I always do, the vignetting and the dispersion. So now I think I do a little bit of a test render. And that's what we get. I thought it was cool. I was pleased with how it came out. I think I just do one or two more test renders. Oh, I might adjust the camera here a little bit. And then do one or two more test renders. Oh, I put a little bit of surface on that inner object. I just put a little reflection, 10 and 50. Same thing I did on the other ones, but on this one I don't use any color highlights. And I make it a little bit darker. I just wanted to give something that was reflective in the center there. Like I said, I didn't go crazy with the surfacing. I could have spent a lot more time on the surfacing. But this is already going on an hour or so. So this is just last test render here. And that's it, pretty much. That's all there is to it. I thought it was kind of cool the way it turned out. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care, guys.